Ani, and hello, welcome back to ChigNotes for episode 6 this week. So this week we're talking about chapters 1 through 8 for the new book that we're looking at here called Code Talkers. So there it is there. And so for the synopsis, so in these first 8 chapters we learn a lot about Key, or Ned, and his childhood experiences. Right away we realize that he's going to the Rehoboth Mission School in order to learn English, which will ultimately help his family and help them understand the American laws and interact with other Americans. At this school, they are immediately told that they can no longer speak their Navajo language, and they are stripped of their culture in many different ways. The children are abused if they are caught speaking this language, and for other reasons, instead of speaking English, and they are all given new names here as well, and all while they were still continuing to speak Navajo in secret, though. So Ned ended up being sort of a model student in the eyes of these teachers, despite sort of having his secret language going on still, but he really did excel in a lot of his schoolwork, and he eventually finishes the grades that this school has and then moves on to high school, which is a bit closer to home for him. He learns a lot in this school, which is slightly less abusive, and becomes fascinated with Japan as well. Around this time, the attack on Pearl Harbor occurs and America joins World War II. Ned really wants to join the Marines and participate in the war effort, but he is too young by both legal standards and by his parents' standards, so he ends up having to wait one more year. When the Navajo military recruiters come back to his community, Ned is definitely thrilled, and because he's able to speak both English and Navajo still, and because he lied about his age, he enlists. Soon he will be working with the Navajo who developed a secret code they mention. So this sums up the first chapters, and we can move into those discussion questions. So for this question, which was, in the first chapters, we learn about the mission boarding school that many Navajo children attended. What similarities can we draw to Canadian residential schools and or today's school systems? What changes can be made to education to ensure that Indigenous children have a culturally safe learning environment? So the first thing that was discussed on this sort of question here was the theme of sort of like genocide and how children in both American and Canadian boarding residential schools were stripped of their cultures and forced to assimilate to Western norms in terms of their language, their looks, their attitudes, their beliefs. It was lightly paralleled here with the Catholic school system and its continued sense of superiority compared to Indigenous faith or beliefs. And in previous generations, how kids were punished for being left-handed and were forced to use their right hand for no other reason than assimilation to a normative idea that was held in the church and that school system. This led us to discussing the effectiveness of a punishment-based system rather than a reward-based system. We talked about how some forms of punishment that were used in residential schools can, to a very small degree, still be found in school systems today, such as the isolation tactics as a form of punishment and ridiculing children in front of their peers at times as well, unfortunately. We then emphasized how traumatizing and inhumane isolation tactics are, which are often used as forms of punishments in our systems to varying degrees. And in this book's case, the most direct isolation was whenever they chained that child in the basement alone and sort of starved him a little bit. But also removing these children from their homes and having them, not see their families for extended periods of time was definitely very damaging for them, and was another isolation tactic as well. We then paralleled this with today and how there are many Indigenous fly-in students to schools, especially in the North. And these, students coming off reserve to live and go to school with the other students, a lot of them have died, unfortunately. And the ones that haven't died have ended up with a lot of mental health issues as well. So that's a huge problem we talked about. This also happens as many Indigenous students still have to board with families, even if it's not like a fly-in situation. There are situations like in our community here where the reservation is an island, or it's really isolated. So to go back and forth from the mainland to school is really challenging. So There are situations where children have to board with families on the mainland, and that's something that happens within Canada as well. And we all had agreed that a way to create a safer learning space for Indigenous students would be to incorporate Indigenous worldviews, cultures, and ways of life into the education systems. And for example, here, having smudging ceremonies or traditional healers available, and not just sort of guidance counselors or things like that. Sort of having a cultural element to all these different sort of services would be really helpful for Indigenous students. On the same note, it was noted that teachers need to be far better supported to provide these, contents and spaces to Indigenous children. Because, when there are curriculum changes, as great as that is, many teachers either don't get around to adding those new contents into the school year, or they don't really know how to accurately depict these histories or tell these stories, and this information that they themselves, they weren't taught that, so it's difficult for them to then have to compile all these resources and give those out to students. So it's definitely challenging for teachers, and just finding ways to support them would be really helpful, we thought. We then discussed the idea of self-determination, and that the need for more Indigenous-led and run schools was sort of an issue today. And then the need for funding these was a huge element to that. Taking into account the value of people's teachings, and determining curriculum as well. Perhaps not requiring the same qualifications for Indigenous specific teachers, since sometimes it's more important to just have a good, knowledgeable teacher that is really relevant to a community and seen as important to that community, rather than having someone who has all the proper degrees and certificates to sort of teach in the school boards. So we kind of just discussed alternative ways to provide better access for students to comfortable and relevant learning spaces. And then finally, this led us to sort of question ways we can keep these youth in school as well, since dropouts and skipping was a really big problem as well. So we wondered, what an answer to this could be, but that was just, we never really came up with one. We just sort of discussed the issue itself. So that was it for this question, and we can move on into the next. So this question is, why do you think Ned wants to partake in the Marines even after all the generations of displacement and trauma? So we all sort of unanimously agreed here that there was definitely a sense that the Navajo people were joining the military to sort of defend and protect the land that is sacred to them, and that always has been. They've been inhabiting that land for a long time before the Americans had. So they had this sense of sort of duty to their land to protect it. So that was likely an element that we thought contributed to why Ned wanted to participate in the Marines, and other Navajo people as well. We also noted that some Indigenous cultures are very collectivistic typically, and that perhaps there was a sense of sort of selflessness and trying to protect others in the community and on the land, and that sacrificing was an honorable and necessary sort of commitment for the survival of the community and their families as well. We then noted that the propaganda actually and the marketing campaigns were extremely successful during that time period of World War II, and they also could have had a really big effect on Ned and others' actions as well, as far as joining that sort of movement in the military as well. So that could have been an element at play here. There was also a sense of pride and excitement to demonstrate the Navajo language and use it for good for the country, that they can save lives with it. And having been told for so long how useless it was, this was kind of their chance to prove them wrong. It was also a chance for these people to use their English as well. That they had been put through so many like unspeakable sort of experiences and endured so much abuse in order to try to force them to unlearn that language. But here was their chance to demonstrate how useful it really is and how important it is to have diverse languages. So that was potentially an element to it as well. And sort of being able to speak English would sort of almost not justify in any sort of way the actions that were taken against these children, but at least it made it the experience of going through these residential schools and boarding schools sort of valuable to these kids, since they could suddenly use this English and Navajo together. So perhaps gave some meaning to that experience despite how awful they were. We then discussed that perhaps the assimilation tactics used in these schools and in the communities had to some degree actually worked, since not everyone would be able to resist them, of course, naturally. So potentially some genuinely joined the Marines because they just sought to join that larger Western culture and sort of be part of that United States of America now, as opposed to their Navajo Nation. So potentially small elements of that assimilation actually did take effect on these children and adults who did join the army. Finally, we noted that Ned really had an objective interest in Japan too, actually, and that sort of sparked a lot of his interest in joining the war in order to interact in some kind of way with Japan, since he was really curious about them, since he had been writing his essay and doing a lot of research about them. So that probably contributed to why he wanted to participate in that interaction. And now we can go on to the last question. So this last question here is, tradition is the enemy of progress, were the first English words the Navajo children learned to read at boarding school. Does this saying still prove true to American values today? What are some parallels you can draw between this phrase sentiment and today's Western cultural climate? So here it was noted immediately that this statement, that tradition is the enemy of progress, now seems like a very big contradiction and was sort of hypocritical, since the United States, at this moment in time anyways, is extremely set on maintaining tradition in the sense of, family values, not allowing immigrants in because they want to maintain a sort of whiteness to the country, and also the tradition of white supremacy and everything that holds the system up is really sought after to be kept and is sort of a conservative sort of value now. So we thought that was really hypocritical and ironic, really. The group agreed that it seems like when it's Western tradition or culture, then it's seen as important to progress and important to keep and maintain. But when it's a culture's tradition that, isn't Western culture, and these are suddenly in the way of Western traditions and power or capitalist expansion, then these traditions are deemed unimportant and not valuable. There was a parallel drawn to show an example of this, and in the way many people are fighting to keep monuments erected right now of these historical figures who have been seen as important to Western culture, but were extremely harmful to Indigenous cultures and other people of color in their culture within this region of North America. So that was sort of one example that was paralleled here. We noted that this is all true, in our eyes for Canada and the United States, despite this book just being based in the U.S. At this moment in the U.S., the Republican president, the tradition is a main element to their platform, having family values, all these things we mentioned sort of be kept is really important to their platform, which is really interesting and ironic, seeing how a lot of this was based on this notion of tradition being the enemy of progress. So there's a bit of irony there, right? We also discussed the different ideas of tradition, and some in the group, when they hear tradition, they think of family traditions, like, Christmas gatherings and things that you eat at these sort of events being tradition when this word is used, whereas others see this as community and cultural traditions. We talked about how the context can really give different connotations to this word. For example, some members mentioned that, when the word tradition is discussed in political context, this is seen as being, conservative and like opposing to progress and equality, and sort of leaves a bad taste in your mouth. But when tradition is talked about in the context of Indigenous or other cultures, it is seen as something, really positive, to be enjoyed and respected. So it was really interesting to contrast how that word can take on different meanings and different sort of feelings for people whenever it's in different contexts. And we finished the discussion by noting that, language is really at the center of culture and tradition, and that it was, a disturbingly effective measure to restrict Navajo people from speaking their languages when they were attempting to destroy their traditions and cultures, and essentially them as people, really. And that's sort of where we ended on there for this discussion and this week. Next week, we will cover chapters 9 to 14 inclusive, and we're really excited to read more of this book and get more into Ned's story. So thank you, miigwech, and see you next time on ChigNotes.